afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this online EU democracy reform conversation brought to you by the EPC's EU Democracy Reform Observatory, which aims to foster discussion on the future of the European integration process in the context of an enlarging union at this critical juncture and against the backdrop of a new era where we are facing multiple fundamental geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges and shocks, major transformations and fundamental challenges related to the future of liberal democracy. My name is Jackie Davis. I am a senior advisor to the EPC, and today we're going to focus, as we did at our last democracy reform conversation, on enlargement. Title of our session today, Enlargement and Internal EU Reform, Will Europe Finally Match Vision with Action? And this, of course, coming in the wake of the publication of the European Commission's 2025 enlargement packet. Delighted to have with us Corinna Stratolat, the EPC's Associate Director and Head of the European Politics and Institutions Programme, Yanis Emanuelidis, EPC's Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, Berta Lopez Domenech, Policy Analyst in the EPC's European Politics and Institution Programmes, and last but not least, Johannes Greibel, Senior Policy Analyst and Head of the EPC's Programme and Connecting Europe Project Lead. A very warm welcome to you all. If you want to join the conversation, as always, either write your question in the Q&A box or click on the raised hands button and I will come to you. So, there's a question in the title of our event today. Corinna, let me come to you first. It asks, will Europe finally match vision with action? We can't, and we'll come back to this later, answer that in relation to the internal reform process because we didn't get what we were hoping to get there, but we can analyse it in relation to the enlargement package itself. You wrote, Corinna, a very scathing, to-the-point commentary last week saying the EU's enlargement file was still lost in translation, and I add, and I'm quoting you, Brussels never met a crisis it could not manage through footnotes. Why were you so scathing about the package and what it tells us about where we are in this process?
Thank you, Jackie. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I was critical of the package because I thought it read like a business as usual document in a moment that is anything but business as usual. If we think that Europe faces an existential geopolitical test, well, the tone of the package sounded very procedural, with a lot of cautious language, incrementalism, and a clear reluctance to, well, take the bull by the horns, to say so. You can feel from the package that the Commission is hedging, constrained by, probably, most likely, by member state sensitivities. So instead of setting a bold political direction, both for the candidates and the Union itself, it sort of felt as if the package retreated into management mode. It calibrated, categorized, delayed these things. And of course, postponing the pre-enlargement reform reviews is only symptomatic of that.
That surprised you, Corinna? Were you optimistic of getting more?
Well, the surprise for me is not what's in the document, but rather what's missing, right? So it's this sense of urgency, of purpose, of leadership that are fit for the current moment, that is missing, and this is what I expected more.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if your colleagues agree with you, and then we'll delve into some of the detail there. Berta, from your perspective, when you look at that document, was it what you expected? Were you too disappointed by what it didn't do? But what do you read into it overall?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Jack. It's a pleasure to be here in this setup, the five of us again. I agree with Corinna. I think that the package in general is insufficient, and unfortunately or not, it's a little bit what we were expecting. I think maybe it is not the Commission to blame, but rather, as Corinna was mentioning, you know, like this consciousness or this being a little bit cautious with the positions of member states. I think that there are some things to highlight in terms of like the change of tone of the package in different instances. For instance, like it's the first package, like maybe like looking at the positive side of it, it's the first time that the package acknowledges openly that an accession can take place during the present mandate. This is one of the opening lines of the package. The Commission openly endorses the established targets that Albania and Montenegro set for themselves to close accession negotiations by 2026 and 2027 respectively. It acknowledges also that other candidates have also established deadlines for themselves, although it doesn't endorse them openly as it does for Montenegro and for Albania. This is something that last year already Kos was acknowledging, the Commissioner Marta Kos was acknowledging when she spoke about the package, but the package itself was not including, which it is a good sign, I would say. Although, as Corina was mentioning, like we know that ultimately the last word is not on the side of the Commission. Then it also openly endorses gradual integration, which again, also last year it was featured in the package, but maybe not as prominently as this year. One of the issues I see here is that although the idea of gradual integration is to accelerate or facilitate the integration of candidates within with the EU ahead of accession, I fear that now it is being used as a way to delay forever the final goal, which is full accession. Having said that,
I want to come back on that a little bit later, if I might, Berta, just try to get a full picture, but a more optimistic in that sense of at least acknowledging progress made. And as you say, for the first time, talking about concrete dates in some cases. Johannes, you have repeatedly called for the EU to think enlarged, and maybe briefly remind those who haven't joined us before on these conversations what thinking enlarged means. And when you look at this package, did you see greater signs of thinking in the way you believe they should, or were you disappointed?
Thanks, Jackie. First of all, I wanted to agree with what Corina and Berta said. I think we've seen an enlargement package that shows, on the one hand, clear progress on some sides in some candidate countries, particularly Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, Moldova, but not much progress on the EU side itself, with the same issues, the same sentiments, blockages, same business as usual dragged on like in the past. So we see this clear dissonance between the two sides. Now, one of the positives that indeed I would outline is that thinking enlarged, this notion of the EU thinking enlarged is becoming more central in the EU's approach to enlargement. For a very long time, we said the EU needs to think enlarged, meaning to design policy, to act already as an EU, or as if there's an EU of 30, 35 members involving candidate country actors now and not only after accession. And that is something where we see clear tendencies for that to happen. We see that in the past years already, for example, in the involvement of the rule of law report, but also and particularly with the release of this package, we heard Commissioner Kos announcing that candidate countries will be part of the Democracy Shield, the Media Resilience Program, the Civil Society strategy, which is an important signal in itself. We still don't know what that will mean. We will know much more later this week when these packages will be published, but I think it's a very important sign in the right direction to adopt this moment of thinking enlarged more centrally into EU decision making.
Thank you. So we have a mixed picture here. I think if I was assessing this as a sort of school report, so far it would be could do better, but in some areas we note encouraging progress. I think that would sum it up. Hang on, Corina, I want to come to Yanis first for his overall assessment, then we'll dive into the discussion. Yanis, your sense, where do you lie on this spectrum of positivity, negativity, if I can put it that way? And you have called a paper you all wrote together earlier this year called Test of Times. You called for an enlargement roadmap, looking very clearly at the resources needed, the time, and so on. Do you feel that this constitutes the sort of roadmap you were looking for, or are there huge elements missing?
I think there are huge elements missing. And that relates to the fact that the level of ambition is not at the level it should be when it comes to what we call the enlargement imperative, and by the also when it comes to the reform imperative, which we'll be discussing later on. So we're not matching the words which we have expressed, the promises which we've given with concrete deeds. Yes, things are progressing, things are moving, but I think the level at which things are moving is not at the speed it should be. Also, when you take into account the potential enlargement to countries which have been mentioned, Albania, Montenegro, this would account to what we have called a limited enlargement, so that you say one or two countries join. I could use stronger language. I could say it would be a fig leaf enlargement, meaning that you can partially fulfill the promise you've made with respect to one or the other, especially those cases which will not do you harm when you see things from the perspective of the EU 27 or some countries of the EU 27. And that, I think, is not living up to the test of times which we have identified when it comes to the geopolitical, the geoeconomic challenges which we're all facing. And by the way, it also is not living up to what we actually should see as the main narrative, which is that we're not doing candidates any favor by admitting them to the EU. Enlargement is something which is in the interest of the EU itself. It is in the interest of the EU 27. But we are treating enlargement still as it being potentially costly, dangerous, difficult, complex, and at the end, maybe even undermined some of the basic values we have. And I would fundamentally doubt that this is the right narrative.
Okay, I want to come back on that and link that to something Corinna said about procedural. But just before I come back to Corinna here, I'm just wondering, when you said a limited enlargement, then you called it a fig leaf. But nevertheless, in your own paper, you looked at different options for enlargements, and yes, you wanted the big bang, very ambitious, but you said that wasn't realistic. You favoured, therefore, what you called strategic regattas, so countries joining in consecutive waves. Does this not, when you see two countries being told, yes, you're pretty much on track to achieve it in the timeline you said, another two, when we talk about Ukraine and Moldova, okay, we see your target, but you would have to accelerate a great deal to meet it. Is that not consecutive waves of the type you called for? Why are you so strong in saying you think it might be a fig leaf?
Well, if we're talking about the strategic option, which is a limited enlargement, meaning we have one or two countries joining, and afterwards the process is put to a halt,
But
then obviously this would not be.
Sorry, yeah, why?
Because I feel that in many discussions which I have, also behind closed doors, that there still is the sentiment that enlargement is not in our interest. Now, and some member states really are fearing the enlarging process, rather than seeing it as an opportunity and as a necessity. So I would fear that if we move towards having one or the other country joining, that actually is moving us to what we called a limited enlargement process, which is not adequate to what we require. And let's add to that, and this goes, beyond the enlargement package. It goes to the bigger, broader discussion. If we see the debate about Ukraine, and the question of whether Ukraine has an opportunity to really join the European Union, I feel that many countries, and by the way, let's be frank, we have a totally different debate about enlargement since 2022 because of the war in Ukraine. But I have the sense that there are a good number of actors who would not want Ukraine to join the European Union. And that would mean that you would have a totally different momentum.
Okay, just Berta and Corinna, you both want to come in on this. Let me just throw into the mix. I mean, Yanis there being concerned, you might do one, you might do two, but you don't actually intend to do them all. Others arguing, and I think it's something that several of you have in papers you've written for the EPC, that Montenegro joining in this cycle, even if that was the only one, would send an important signal, would boost the credibility of the process. Berta, is that you wanted to jump in? Let Berta come in and then Corinna. Why did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Yanis was saying, like, to which I completely agree, that precisely the fact that the EU is not, like, the Commission is not releasing this pre-enlargement policy reviews document, and that we are not really having a conversation on how to prepare the EU for a larger enlargement, makes us think or be suspicious that this might be the case, that we have a fig leaf enlargement. So that if we would be about to have like a real like strategic regatta, the EU would need to start preparing itself for it, and we don't think that's the case. As per whether Montenegro's accession would send a positive signal, I do think that Montenegro's accession, or Montenegro and Albania's accession, would send a very good a very positive signal for the rest of the Western Balkan candidates. So for those that have been kept on the waiting room for 20 years and that now they see the EU again having a discourse that enlargement is back on the agenda, but the credibility of it, I do think that until there is not an accession, Bosnia, Serbia, North Macedonia, those countries that have to carry out very difficult, politically very difficult reforms, until they don't see that this will really like pay off, it's very difficult to expect these reforms.
Thank you, Corina. I asked you to wait, please.
No, I just wanted to add, and I, in the context of the overall picture about the package, I don't want to pull cold water on all the positive points that were mentioned, because indeed it's true that there is the package acknowledges progress where it exists, and then also calls out backsliding, signaling a more differentiated approach. But I think I want to mention the point that when it comes to the laggards, I think the picture is a lot more sobering than we like to admit, because the issues that are holding back these countries, rule of law, state capture, media freedom, political polarization, unresolved statehood issues, constitutional paralysis, bilateral disputes. I mean, these are precisely the kind of issues that the EU has been wrestling with for decades, and largely to no avail so far. So the fact that we still lack durable solutions to these stubborn problems, and that the package doesn't really propose any sort of breakthrough cures for any of those, isn't actually particularly reassuring for the road ahead. And this is also where the strategic regatta idea matters, because for us it was never about each country when it's ready. It was about a continuous politically guided enlargement process that sort of moves in tandem with EU internal reform, so that the widening also means strengthening. But if these countries beyond Albania and Montenegro cannot really fulfill a merit-based process because of all these problems we cannot get to the bottom of, and then on top of that, the pre-enlargement policy reviews and the EU's own preparations, part of the equation is missing, then of course the strategic regatta model doesn't really work.
Got you. There's a question from someone in the audience saying, do you think it would be Montenegro and Albania first, then Ukraine and Moldova, or do you think for the political imperative, I'm adding those words in, but would it be all four joining together? Be interested to see what you think. But Johannes, you wanted to jump in as well.
Yeah, I think indeed that Montenegro, Albania are the most realistic at that point in time. But just following up from what Corina said before, of course, it would be a very important signal for those to join. But the problem that I see is that beyond the two of them joining, I don't see a discussion about the bigger picture, and not the perception of that being a first step in a broader process, but rather this will be as far as we can get, and that is the problem about this set of play.
But isn't, I mean, the fundamental problem we have here, I mean, Ursula von der Leyen said, we are more committed than ever to turning EU enlargement into a reality. The question I think I'm having is, who is we in this context? Because it would seem, certainly from everything you're saying, that the problem here is not you're encouraged by the language the Commission uses, but what you're doubting, and Yanis, correct me if I'm wrong, you're doubting the member states' willingness, and this is why that very procedural language and so on. And so your call that you've all made repeatedly for this not to be just a technical process, for this to be, goes back to your point about narratives and whose interest is it in. The problem here is the member states. Do you really, Yanis? So when Ursula von der Leyen says we are more committed than ever to turning it into a reality, is that honestly true if we're talking about the EU, because it's the whole EU that will have to decide in the end?
Well, committed to turn things into reality could also mean that you have one or two members, new members joining the European Union.
True.
You
Yep.
could then argue, yes, we did what we had committed to. We are in a totally different period than we were, let's say, when the Juncker Commission started and enlargement was said it would never happen, so let's push it aside. Obviously, we're living in different circumstances. But going back to the technical political, it is very naive to believe that enlargement is a technical exercise. At the end of the day, it is very much a political exercise. So you can say, yes, strict, fair, merit-based, and this is the dogma you raise and what you repeat all the time, but it is embedded in a wider political process. By the way, if you look into history of previous rounds of enlargement from the 1970s up till 2004, 8, 7, it has always been a political process. So also the question which was posed to us, would it be only including Albania, Montenegro, or would it also include Ukraine? We cannot answer that question because I do not know where we will be in 2 or 3 years' time. But actually, we need to prepare for potentially having this kind of a process happening. But if you look into reality, beyond the official discourse, it is not like it was in 1989, 1990, and thereafter, where there was a strong appreciation that enlargement would happen. We didn't know when, we didn't know who will be included, but we knew that the fall of the Iron Curtain means something. It has a relevance. So when von der Leyen says we need a reunification of Europe or fulfill the reunification, I have doubts that member states are thinking along those lines. They still want to, potentially, if they could, avoid it because they think it is a burden on them and on Europe in general. And it's not only one or the other member states, it's broader than that. So we have not fully understood the historical significance of where we are finding ourselves now. We're still treating it technically, whereas we should be treating it politically, which at the end is a political process.
Corinna, can I come back to you? Because I mentioned your scathing to the point. You were equally scathing recently about the idea of this plan B. So when we talk about member states' reluctance over enlargement, looking at the issue of Hungary and particularly Ukraine and the blocks on that process, and the Commission looking for workarounds to that, technical workarounds. So you could open chapters but not close them was one suggestion. Another was you could treat it very much as a technical legalistic process for now. And you said in another commentary, it doesn't solve the problem, it just delays it and demonstrates the EU's lack of political courage. But they do have to find a plan B for now, don't they? Because there is no other solution to the sort of blockage that Hungary is putting on the process at the moment.
Okay, I'll respond that, but then I want to go back to Albania, Montenegro, Ukraine, and Moldova question. So look, I understand why the Commission is exploring ways to outflank spoilers, and I say spoilers in plural because Hungary is not the only spoiler. Let's be clear about that. But I think such ingenious tactics are basically symptomatic of a deeper problem. If we need ad hoc fixes to bypass vetoes, then for me, it means that the Union hasn't yet found a sustainable political consensus on enlargement. So, okay, plan B might work technically or tactically, but strategically, it won't do away with the fact that the Union has yet to build the political consensus and the sense of purpose that can drive enlargement forward in its own terms. And then, of course, there is also the question of why the candidate countries themselves would want to undertake politically sensitive, economically costly reforms if what's offered in return is only technical progress, not a credible political horizon, you know, a pat on the shoulder for doing good work behind closed door instead of actual advantages or rewards as part of a real accession process. So this is my take on the plan B. I don't think we need a plan B. We just need the member states to put their money where their mouth is with regards to enlargement, and
And on the
to
question
dare
of the
to have
floor?
the hard conversations about the budget, about the institutions, about
We're coming to
voting.
that in a moment. We're coming to
Yeah,
that in a moment.
but
On the question about the four, you wanted to comment
on
on.
the questions about the four, I think my honest opinion at this point in time is that having the four of them come at the same time right now, it would be very difficult because of the EU in reality, more than anything else, because the EU for countries like Ukraine in particular, it would need to put in the hard work needed to prepare itself. So a more feasible scenario or option is that Montenegro and Albania come in because they're smaller, they're more easily digestible, they won't really put that much strain on the EU, be it in budgetary terms or institutional terms or voting terms. And then, of course, for Ukraine and by association, Moldova, although Moldova is definitely not in the same league as Ukraine when it comes to the scope and size, then the EU would actually need to have a look at the reforms necessary to prepare its so-called absorption capacity.
Thank you. Berta, can I come to you on this question? I think it was Yanis was talking earlier about this gradual integration, and oh no, you mentioned it. You said this phrase is in there, the gradual integration. We have a number of questions from our audience about this idea that it is gradual, that full membership rights do not come when you join, and that there would be this sort of safeguards to prevent backsliding. Frauke Siebas says there is a fear that the lack of internal reform drive will result in worse conditions for new members. The new buzzword, Frauke calls it a buzzword, being safeguards, which would make them second-rate members, e.g. no bilateral veto rights. What is your take on that? And somebody else asking, is the proposal to temporarily relinquish the veto right for new members becoming a conditione sine qua non for future enlargements? How do you see this whole debate about post-accession mechanisms, presumably designed to assuage those who worry about letting new members in, but what about its impact on those who are coming in?
Well, I think that first of all, it's again like we keep stressing this message like throughout our conversation. It's not a good sign that we are looking for alternatives to internal reform. Like safeguards cannot be like by any chance be a substitute for internal reform. These are like two different, well, of course linked, but two different conversations. On the issue of safeguards, the Commission has been very clear, at least Commissioner Martakos was very clear in saying that this proposal did not mean or was not intended to lead to have two classes of members, ones with veto rights, ones without, so that once a member state joins the EU in full capacity. And I would agree with that. The idea of safeguards, I think that it depends a little bit on the approach that you take with enlargement. If now we would go for a big bang enlargement because we would consider that geopolitically we are at a point in time where we need enlargement now, safeguards could be an alternative to prevent democratic backsliding, to prevent bilateral conflicts, or to give the EU a bit more time to deal with these bilateral conflicts between member states and new and old member states, and between new member states. However, as I was saying in my initial intervention, I fear that in the end, this talk about gradual integration, and now this, as Frauke was labeling buzzword of the safeguards, it's being used as a way to continue delaying the end goal. So to find alternatives or to find ways to pretend that we are still moving ahead when there is no political will to complete the process, while actually the main goal should continue to be full membership.
Indeed. Just coming back on this question of the narrative, because we have a number of questions from our audience, and they link, I think, also to Johannes, what I want to talk to you about in terms of thinking in large and what that means about the role of civil society, both in the candidate countries and in the existing EU member states. So the two questions from our audience: what do you think is the perspective of the EU population on the benefits of enlargement? For a majority, is it rather a burden to be best avoided or a strategic necessity? This links to the comments Yanis made in his opening interventions. Second one, given that enlargement is still widely perceived among member states as a strain on the union's cohesion and resources, how can the EU reshape its narrative so it's seen as a shared strategic advantage rather than a collective burden? Yanis, I will also give you a chance to respond on that, but I wanted to link it to the discussion about citizen participation in this whole process and their trust in the process on both sides, as I say, in countries that are in the EU and in countries joining. And Johannes, you wrote a paper published at the end of last month on this very topic. So your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, and I think that is why it is so important to have that conversation together. On the one side, on the EU's side, when it comes to future enlargement, and then also among candidate countries and future member states. I think that you can see on the one hand that support in public opinion polls for enlargement has gone up recently, particularly in recent years. And particularly when it comes to the time right after Russia's invasion to Ukraine, which indicate that there is an understanding of the geopolitical necessity and the geopolitical link between enlargement and geopolitics. So I think I do see that this link is perceived, but because of that, and particularly because of the costs that are involved in it, it is important to have these conversations together, and it is important to have these conversations in the first place. Particularly on the latter, we're avoiding these kind of conversations right now, including by delaying the policy reviews and reforms.
Thank you. Yanis and then Corinna.
Just one thought related to the Plan B approach of the Commission. So I could go further back. And as Corinna was saying, rightly so, it's not only Hungary or the current government in Hungary which is a problem. This is a bigger problem when it comes to skepticism towards EU enlargement. It's not only Hungary, which means that it's all the more important that those who actually are really in favor of further rounds of enlargement and not fig leaf enlargement, that they need to step up the game. They need to become more vocal when it comes to EU enlargement. They need to push that process. They need to push also the internal EU reform process. So they need to counter those who are the ones who are actually negative about enlargement. And that's not what we're seeing. We're not seeing that there are certain member states and national capitals who are ready to invest political capital into really making enlargement happening and into pushing beyond a limited enlargement and reforming the EU at the same time. We don't see that happening. With respect to the safeguards and transition periods, we're all aware, and we've seen that in the past, that there is a need for transition periods, there's a need for certain safeguards, where, by the way, you need to be very specific of what you're talking about also when it comes to the full voting rights. Are they limited to certain areas? Are they more general? Are they time limited? So how would you put them in place? There are a lot of questions that you would have to address when it comes, for example, to the full voting rights. But the basic thinking behind it, and that's my second point, the basic thinking behind it is that the new member states will be a problem once they join the European Union. Whereas we're having already a problem in the current EU with current governments, with current member states, when it comes to issues which require consensus. So assuming this logic becoming the prevailing logic is that the new member states are the problem is the wrong logic. We have a more fundamental issues that we need to tackle, and then we need to have a debate about that. And by the way,
that will link to where we're going to go with this conversation in a moment. Yeah.
And by the way, also because we might experience cases in future where a bigger number of EU member states themselves become problematic, and they're already within the club. So it's the totally wrong logic we're following when it comes to, for example, the issue of full voting rights.
Thank you. And as I want to come back on that, what we are actually the fundamental problem, as you say, created also by existing member states. And that links to the conversation about the pre-enlargement reviews. But Corinna, I know you want to come in, and just if you would, as part of this, pick up on another question just come in from our audience. If Orban wins again in the upcoming elections in Hungary in April next year, would the EU, do you think, lean to decouple Moldova from Ukraine, or or would it be better to activate Article 7 against Hungary as a possible route? I don't see any appetite among member states for going down that road, hence this talk about workarounds of a different kind. But perhaps if how you see that playing out. But you also, I think, wanted to react to the question I put to Johannes and to Yanis.
Yes, just a couple of thoughts. When it comes to the safeguards question, I think there's a deeper issue there, because if such safeguards are to be embedded in the treaties to prevent democratic backsliding, for instance, why should they apply only to newcomers? I mean, the rule of law is not a pre-accession condition, or it's not just a pre-accession condition, it's a founding principle. And by the way, such safeguards would also help with the single market question that was raised by the public. And if the EU wants credible mechanisms to protect it, I think those should bind all member states equally, and not just those coming in next, which goes along the same lines as Yanis was arguing. So if you ask me, the smarter approach would be not to dilute membership, but actually to strengthen EU's own internal enforcement tools, so that all members, existing and new ones, can be held to the same rules. That's
which links to the EU internal reform debate, which is where I want to go in just a moment.
Yes, but then I also wanted to point out that when it comes, because there were a lot of questions about public opinion in the member states, and I wanted to make two short points about that. The first is that if you look at the latest Eurobarometer, what you see is actually quite, that's public sentiment in favor of enlargement has started to pick up. So it's the rates of support are over 50. And of course, this is a very positive sign, given the growing Euroscepticism that we had to deal with in the past. Of course, it's still mostly concentrated among the young educated population, which is an issue, but still it's picking up. And this, to me, stands quite in an interesting opposite with what's happening, for example, in the Balkan countries, where actually public sentiment towards European integration and accession has actually been falling behind,
because they feel
all of these countries
they feel let down. They feel let down.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we're seeing actually things when it comes to the public moving in opposite directions. And the second small things on that to say is that ultimately it's up to the to those who talk and construct public opinion and contribute to forming public opinion, to opinion shapers and makers, to decide where do they want to concentrate. Will enlargement come with costs?
I'm going to have
for sure it will.
Okay,
it will have an impact.
I'm going to have to stop you there. We need to get on to the second half of this conversation, but just very briefly, anybody think activating Article 7 against Hungary? I think Article 7 is about flouting the fundamental values and laws.
Yes, but so it also requires.
It wouldn't apply here anyway, because
but it would also require a certain threshold that to be activated, which isn't going to be met. And of course, we still have to find ourselves in a situation where member states would actually want Moldova to join and Ukraine to be left waiting.
Okay,
so
let's leave that for now.
It's also a sensitive question. It's not really a solution to anything.
Indeed. Okay, I want to move on, and it linked. You mentioned there is a question from Philippe Hamro-Dortz in our Q&A box about how to secure the proper functioning credibility of the single market in the context of enlargement. The reason, Philippe, I didn't raise that till now is because I think this very much falls into what we want to talk about now, which is the second thing we had expected to be discussing today, namely the EU enlargement policy and reform reviews, which were supposed to outline what the EU should do itself to prepare for enlargement. And you've all made reference to that. And the single market would be one, so it would look at budget issues, governance issues, and so on. And the single market and the proper function of that would come into it. But we don't have that report. And Johannes, the EPC had an event last week, and I think you can give us a little bit of a sense of what's happened to it. There was talk of it being November the 19th. It's now not November the 19th. Where is it? And do we know why it's delayed?
Yeah, and indeed, thanks, Jackie. Indeed, we were supposed to have this conversation on both sides. And initially, for a very long time, it seemed like both documents were indeed coupled, which we thought was a very good sign, because it signals that both processes, both enlargement and the EU's internal reform, should be thought together as two sides of the same coin. And without reform, we cannot go beyond a very limited form of enlargement. We need reform in any case, but particularly if we want to go ahead. So it was a very disappointing sign to see that slipping off last minute. And indeed, it shows that the EU is clearly divided. What we've heard is indeed that despite media outlets reporting that it might be mid-November, it looks more and more like we need much more time for these to come out. Last week at our event with Director General Koopman, moderated by Corinna, he told us that the EU wanted to prioritize quality over speed, that we would need to, or that there would need to be additional internal coordination within the institution, among institutions, until it can be published. So what we see is that there needs to be a larger conversation, that there's clearly different opinions, different positions on these reviews, on these reforms that, seem to be quite fundamental.
Exactly, yes, because as you say, talking about, it sounds like at least the new year, potentially? That was the sense of it, yeah. Yanis, on this point, and the consequences, because as Johannes just reminded us, you have all called all along for these two processes to go hand in hand. You say they are part of the same DNA of the EU, and you have to do them together. And you all pointed to, when we talked about the speed of enlargement and how many countries would join, you all immediately began referencing whether the EU was also preparing itself or not. Your sense of where we are now with this delay, and how serious, I mean, is there any appetite for the sort of reforms that are needed among a majority of member states? Are we, in this case, talking about a few holdouts, a few who are not convinced, or many?
Many, and many who want to avoid having this debate. We're witnessing this ourselves in the work we do with respect to enlargement and reform, how difficult it is to get them into the room to discuss these issues in front of each other. And whenever there are discussions in the council when it comes to reforming, for example, the voting system by using the passerelle clauses, and people who have been in these rooms tell you how member states are arguing either openly against it or not daring to be the ones who are investing the political capital into moving the needle forward. So even, on issues which the treaties allow to have progress, we're not progressing. And the fact what Johannes was describing, it was on the agenda of the Commission College. It was to be decided on the same day as the enlargement package. If you now look into the Commission College agenda, it's not even mentioned. So, and that goes until January. Now, if you would be positive and if you would take up the logic which the Director General was arguing, you could say, well, maybe we need more time to prepare, to coordinate the process, to make sure that we put in place a coordinated process which the member states agree to, so that we make steps in the right direction. I must tell you, I do not believe that story. It is a major issue of contention among member states. Many member states believe that we will drag this process as long as necessary, and when we get to be just ahead of the enlargement moment, we will do what is needed, which means you would do the minimum of what's needed. And I would even doubt that that will be possible at that moment in time, because we've seen, and history has shown us, that if we have enlargement happening, it requires also some time to reform oneself. It doesn't happen in one go. You can also have postponements. But if you have in mind very limited, targeted reforms, which actually are not in line of what we call a gradual progressive reform of the EU, which requires much more than that, which requires a process being put in place in order to reform the EU. By the way, not only because of enlargement, but also because the EU needs to be crisis and future-proof, which it currently is not as an organization, and in view of enlargement, even less so. I think that this is simply showcasing that there are huge differences between the member states, and I'll be even more frank, that the Commission does not want to get caught in these debates between member states. It doesn't have the political courage to
Okay,
move
come
in
back
that
to that.
direction because that it might, from their
Come back
perspective,
to that in a moment.
backfire.
Whether somebody else needs to do that job for the Commission in that case. But we'll come back on that. Berta, in terms of how this will be perceived in the candidate countries, because they had always been told, you know, the EU will prepare itself and we will do what is necessary to make sure we do our homework while you are doing your homework. It seems now we have an enlargement package that reminds many of them what their homework is, with no sign of what the EU's own homework is. How do you think that will be perceived? And then, Corinna, I want to come back to you and link this to what you said earlier about the lack of political courage when we were talking about Plan B. But Berta, how do you think this will be perceived in the candidate countries?
Yeah, I go back to like what I was saying at the start, that in the end, like no matter how strong the EU stresses or the Commission stresses that enlargement is now back on the agenda, that now is the time. If the EU doesn't start preparing for it, I do not, or actually like delivering on it, I do not think that this will actually like trigger reforms in candidate countries. It is true what you were just mentioning, that this year the enlargement package was way more transparent, or like open and clear about what were the steps needed in candidate countries. For instance, in the case of Bosnia, the Commission was outlining very clearly what were the steps in a way more clear manner than in the past, that was sometimes mentioning like fulfill the necessary steps in a kind of like vague wording. But again, if the EU doesn't do what it needs to do, I doubt that a bureaucratic document per se will incentivize North Macedonia to actually amend the constitution, to Bosnia to also like change the constitutional setup and carry out the electoral reform and the constitutional reform and so on.
Indeed. So classic case, Corinna, of do as we say, not as we ourselves are prepared to do.
Yeah, but I also wanted to highlight that, okay, it's true. I mean, it seems that the Commission has done much of the analytical work that that goes into this pre-enlargement review. So, and simply, as my colleagues have pointed out, member states don't seem to be aligned on the level of ambition that they're ready to endorse in these documents, be it on questions like the budget, voting rules, treaty change, and so on. So, yes, in other words, the reviews are ready to land, apparently, but the runway isn't clear yet. But now, even when they do appear, if they appear, okay, I still think that we can expect them to be rather cautious in tone, more about principles and possible scenarios than necessarily firm or ambitious in proposals. And this is useful, but not transformative unless member states really pick them up politically. And in fact, I would think that if they're really very detailed and very honest about both the costs and the benefits, member states could also, or specific actors in the member states can also instrumentalize them to argue against future enlargement.
Indeed.
And this comes back to the question about public opinion, because in the end, if they decide to focus on the cost, then also the policy reviews could backfire and could just give fuel to those who oppose further.
And indeed, someone in our audience asking, how do you think the ongoing debate on the new MFF will impact on the enlargement dossier? You could look at it the other way around, and how do we think the enlargement dossier, is it impacting on the MFF discussion?
Yes, because for now, this is not reflected.
Not even there. It's not even there, is it, at
exactly.
all? Johannes, I think you wanted to pick up on that, but also because we're at limited time. Going back to the point that Yanis was making about the Commission being reluctant to dive into this debate, given the lack of appetite among the member states. You all in your paper, I've mentioned a couple of times, Test of Times earlier this year, suggested one idea might be for the European Council to mandate a wise women or men group, or somebody, an eminent personality, to try and elaborate a sort of roadmap. And that maybe bringing an outside group in could be a way to break the impasse and promote some political buy-in among the member states. Do you think that is a way forward? Is anybody looking at a way out of this dilemma, or are we just going around in circles? What's your sense?
First of all, as mentioned, the reaction to the previous, I think it is indeed not a very good sign towards candidates delaying this document even further and stressing even further, because I just want to remind that this was a document that was supposed to be published last spring already and was already delayed several times. And indeed, coming to the question, indeed, I think the MFF debate signals or illustrates the relevance and the urgency that these reviews and looking at these elements has, because the negotiations are ongoing and we have to get a clear sense on where will we end up and how will that impact the new budget, the negotiations, which will be difficult enough. And then on the Wise Women's Group, I think, yes, I think this is something that could very well help the process in its shape, even when at some point the reviews are out, because as Corinna mentioned, the reviews, the document that we can expect will be a document that will be rather technical by design. At the same time, the situation that we're in shows how sensitive the issue is. So I think indeed that this exercise of how to translate this technical exercise into a political process will be important and will be something for either Wise Women's Group or for an eminent personality, the Draghi model, to follow up on. Yes.
But of course, it has also, Yanis, I've been around far longer than I care to think about, but we've done this before. We've had reflection groups prior to beginning discussions on new EU treaties in the past. So it's nothing new to say, let us appoint a group to look at this in a more dispassionate way, not in the heat of the day-to-day discussions about things. Could it break the impasse? And do you see any appetite for doing that?
If you have the political will to break the impasse, I'm confident that it can help, because especially also in the reviews, which we expect, there are four pillars. The pillar on gradual integration, I think, will be something which will be strongly elaborated. The one on values, we will have a lot of in it, because that's what member states care about when it comes to enlargement. When it comes to the budget and the governance, these are the two pillars where they struggle, and they will continue to struggle. So if you want to get across not only the message that you're serious about enlargement, but actually make progress with respect to issues related to governance and to the budget, you need to find ways of doing that. But I'm telling you, there is a different appreciation. The appreciation is the following scenario. We have promised enlargement. Enlargement will happen. One or two countries, the difficult ones not included, depending on the situation in Ukraine, there will be a reason to keep Ukraine associated, closely aligned, but actually not having it enter the European Union. If there are no atrocity anymore, if the war has ended, the argument will be, well, now the pressure is not as big as it had been. We can find a modus vivendi, plus the country has so many problems with respect to corruption. Do we really need Ukraine? So you limit enlargement, and then you only do the limited stuff you need to do by using the accession treaties to do the technical adjustments which you require to have new countries joining in, and anything that goes beyond that, you don't need to do. This is the ideal scenario for a lot of people within the European Union and governments within the European Union. That's what they actually have in mind, which means that they will fail the test of times. They will fail both the ability of the EU to reform beyond a limited fig leaf enlargement, and they will fail with respect to the EU making itself future and crisis-proof, which means you need to reform the governance structures. And if we fail the test of times, we will not only lose geopolitical credibility, we will also showcase that this project, the European project, is no longer what it has been. And that is playing exactly into the hands of those who want to hollow the union from within. So we're playing the game of those who we are critical and are afraid of, because we're not showing the political will and stamina to get things moving. And sorry for being so blank.
No, not at all. And thank you. And that does link to somebody who says in the audience, said quite a while ago, we often talk about credibility. What does it mean when we're talking about enlargement? And I think you've all made it clear what for you credibility means. And you also there, Yanis, made it very clear, as do a number of key EU leaders, what is at stake and why this matters so much. So let me ask the rest of you, and I'm going to go Johannes, Berta, and finish with Corinna. Many people talk about enlargement as unfinished business, have been doing so for years and years and years. I think it's always been unfinished business and always probably will be. But nevertheless, this round of enlargement is a long time unfinished business. In terms of where we go from here, Johannes, what do we need to do? Whether it relates to the internal reform discussion we were having, whether it relates to the package and the thinking in large, what do we need to do to ensure that there is some momentum? I think we've all agreed there's some momentum, but then we've questioned whether that momentum will ever turn into tangible process because of a lack of appetite. What do we need to do now to make sure that momentum does turn into tangible progress? Your key priority. Johannes, then Berta, then Corinna, and it's a minute and a half each.
Thanks. I'll be very brief. I mean, coming back to the very first intervention and the start of our conversation, I think the headline assessment is that there is progress in candidate countries. The main challenge will be the other side. Will the EU be able to hold up their end of the equation? Will we be able to deliver the reforms that we need to set out? And well, what do we need? First of all, we need the document. We need the reviews to be published finally after so many delays. And then we need a political discussion about what is in those documents. And we need for this process to be carried forward, not only by the Commission, but particularly by the member states. Here, that's the key, member states buy-in to move on the timeline on these internal reforms.
Thank you very much indeed. Berta.
I saw that someone in the Q&A asked about North Macedonia.
Yeah, I haven't been able to go into detail on individual countries in 1 hour with so much to talk about.
No.
I didn't pick up on that
I'm
one.
just gonna use that like to go to answer your question. I think that North Macedonia illustrates perfectly the failure of the EU, like of the EU's enlargement policy over the past 20 years, and why just doing what we've like the same thing that we've been doing will not lead to any positive results. And answering directly to your question, I will just say the same that I said in the conversation we had 6 months ago, which is having an accession during the current, at least one accession, hopefully more than one, during the current institutional cycle. This is for me the only sign, well, not the only sign, but the major sign that will showcase that the EU this time is really being serious about enlargement.
So when we have that
many
question
other
about,
issues.
when we have that question about what does credibility look like, it looks like many things, but one thing it looks like is at least letting somebody join in the very shorter time horizon that they're talking about. Thank you so much, Corinna. And Yanis, I'll give you a chance for a final thought as well.
Well, I mean, to keep with what we've been saying during this entire time, the EU member states need to move from management to leadership. They need to find a way to muster the courage to turn that conviction into delivery, but also to put in the political and institutional work that is required to get the Union in a more solid position to confront not just enlargement now, but all sorts of other critical present and future challenges, which are there and are not going away. This is the test of time, the test of times for us. And I think the real tragedy of failing the test of times would not be a setback for today's officials or politicians, but a betrayal of tomorrow's generations who risk to inherit not a legacy of peace, prosperity, and rule of law, but one of instability, hardship, and renewed conflict. So for me, the danger lies not merely in failing to succeed now, but actually in failing to stand on the right side of history, as we argue in our publication as well.
Thank you so much. So the stakes could not be higher, Yanis, amid some of the doom and gloom of this afternoon, but also some bright moments of, well, at least we've got, maybe some people would call it clutching at straws, but there have been some positive notes about what the package contains. I think I'm reading that all the concern is about the political will. more than anything else. For you, if we are to translate what momentum there is and somehow get that political will to change the narrative that you've talked about, to move us forward, what for you is key now?
I think there are many things, but to have an honest debate and to dare have this debate, and also to have a public debate, because as colleagues were saying, the level of people who want and are positive of enlargement has increased over the past years. But many also say that they have a lot of questions, they have uncertainties. So you need to address this. And this is what I meant earlier. If there are a good number of actors who are against enlargement, those who are in favor of it should foster that debate. They should be courageous to have that debate. Is it an easy one? No, it's not an easy one. And Corina is right. This is about future generations. And how should it then be an easy debate? But we're hiding away from these debates, and that is not only negative from an enlargement perspective, that's also negative from the perspective of European integration in general. So be daring instead of hiding and trying to avoid the tough ones, the tough debates which we need to have.
Thank you. And one of the jobs the EPC has taken on its shoulders is indeed to be daring and to make those proposals and to try, as you say, to get the right people in the room all the time to talk about it openly. We've had marvelous success recently in getting people from the candidate countries to talk about it. More challenging, as Yanis was pointing to get those to talk about the internal EU reform process. But we will not give up. We will come back on this topic and many others in future conversations, and do watch out for more publications from the EPC published under the Observatory auspices analysing developments in this area. Thank you so much again. Always lovely to have you with us. Thank you for all your questions and comments. Apologies we didn't get to all of them. Just to flag up before we go, I mentioned a couple of publications you might want to take a look at, but also a couple of events coming up on this Wednesday, Growing and Reforming the Union, which will focus on the Danish presidency's take and that of the European Parliament on growing and reforming. And then next Monday, Fundamentals First, Moldova's progress and challenges on the road to EU accession. So thank you very much again to all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jackie.
Watch out for the next conversation. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.